Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to today's UNISON webinar. My name is Stephen Smiley. I'm a member of the National Executive Council. I'm from Scotland, and I was privileged to represent UNISON at COP26 and then again at COP27. Today's webinar has started off with some slight technical problems, which we hope to get sorted very quickly. That was the delay in starting the meeting was down to those technical difficulties. I'll do the introductions in a minute, but first of all, just to set the scene a little bit, over the past number of years, UNISON has become more and more aware of the need to tackle climate change and for UNISON and UNISON members to play a key role in how we do that. We've had motions at conference. 2017, we adopted a motion which was in favour of divesting from pension funds divesting from fossil fuels. In subsequent years, we launched campaigns around that. We have agreed motions prioritising the climate change agenda. During COP26, we launched a document, a piece of research that we did about how to decarbonise the public services in the UK. Where we pointed out the need for significant investment within the next 10 years by the UK government to enable public services to play their part in getting to net zero. And we use that to continue our discussions with governments at all levels in the UK. We have set ourselves the ambition of becoming a green union. And there's at National Conference and on the NEC, there's been lots of enthusiasms about that. We recognise that our role within public services is critical. We recognise that we've got lots of talent within our membership who understand the issues, who are part of the solution, and we can actually use those resources that we have available within our membership to take this forward. But that doesn't mean we've got all the answers as to how we do it. So one of the things that UNISON would always do when faced with these kind of situations is we ask the members. And therefore we've conducted a survey, and that's essentially what today's webinar is about. The results of that survey, where our members are telling us what they think, what their concerns are, who should take responsibility, what their hopes and fears, and so on and so forth are about it. And we asked two main speakers today, Professor Vera Trapman and Dr. Joe Cutter from Leeds University's Centre for Employment Relations and Innovational Change to conduct the survey. And Vera and Joe are both with us, and they're going to take us through the results of the survey. After they've finished, Michelle Singleton, who works as one of our policy officers at headquarters and is responsible for leading our work on climate change, will then speak a little bit more about what UNISON is doing and what we hope members can take from the survey and how we can move that forward within our own priority. So thankfully Vera's now joined us, so we're good to go. With that, with no further ado, I'll hand over to Vera and Joe to take us through the survey. I think Vera, you're going to start off. Is that correct? Oh, you're muted, Vera. These things are always a struggle. You're still muted.
John, are you able to unmute Vera's? We still can't hear you.
You're still muted. On my screen, there's a small green circle with a microphone on it. I don't know if you can see that anywhere on your screen. Or if John, essentially, who's doing the techie stuff, if John can unmute you. It doesn't look like it. Let me. No, we're struggling. Oh, something happened there, Vera. No. Very sorry about this. We're obviously having one of those technical difficulty days. Joe, do you want to just maybe start off a little introduction while we try and get Vera unmuted? Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Vera, we're still struggling to hear you. I don't know if you can see the control panel, but I'll share the slides and I'll make a start. And if you're able to join in, oh, I can see your microphone's on green now, Vera. Can you hear us? Oh, what a shame. Okay, I'll proceed and hopefully you can join us. So welcome everyone, thanks for your patience. The tech gods are not with us today, but hopefully we've, you can still hear us okay, and Vera can join us at some point during the discussion. So thanks very much, Stephen, for that introduction. Really, it's always really interesting to hear what different unions are doing. Actually, was at an event with UNISON in, I think it was 2019, discussing the kind of public, the issue around kind of public services and public ownership. Yeah, always interested to hear more about the work that you're doing. But as was introduced, we've been doing work with unions across the UK around this question of their action and activity, both in terms of policy work and on the ground in relation to action on climate change. We undertook a national survey of workers and have been around questions of their kind of climate concerns, and I'll go through the sort of the themes, which we then repeated within UNISON. So we've got the opportunity to do some comparison. We have recently produced this report. After we've spoken, we can drop a link in the chat to that PDF, which is looking specifically at the responses to UNISON members in terms of, and I'm going to go through the results of that, just to open up, in a sense, some of the key themes that are in there. And obviously we've got an opportunity, we've got some recommendations at the end, and an opportunity in the chat, and obviously further, within UNISON, you'll hopefully have an opportunity to have further discussion about what this might mean for your work, whether you're currently a Green Rep or interested in this area of work, or working in a branch where you want to build the kind of action on the environment. Hopefully some of these findings will be of interest to you. So in terms of the themes, we've asked participants of our survey to think about how they perceive the threat of climate change, whether they ask questions about the green transition. I'll explain a bit more about that, their kind of hopes and fears for the greening of the economy, and the extent to which workers feel kind of ready for that transition. And we've also got sort of specific questions around the extent to which people are active, either in their community at home, or indeed in the workplace or through their union in these agendas. So here we go. So just quickly, we undertook a survey which had, we had 372 responses from UNISON members. That donut shows you the different service groups. Obviously the vast majority, the kind of light blue bit at the bottom, shows you local government, not surprisingly, was the largest area of response, but responses from across service groups. We also did some analysis. We identified whether people were themselves a union activist, a union rep, or an active, they considered themselves a kind of an active member in the kind of life of the union, or a not so active member. Now today, I'm not going to discuss the kind of that level of analysis, but there are some interesting findings in the report that kind of break that down a little bit further. And we're also going to compare it to the national study that we did. So it gives you a sense of, well, it's always useful to have a comparison in terms of, well, what do the responses from the UNISON sample mean in terms of, in comparing it to the similar, very, very similar study that we did, that was this nationally representative survey of workers across the UK. So here we go. First of all, views on climate change. So we asked questions, if you see down that left-hand list, levels of concern, whether people feel that the effects of climate change are being felt, and the extent to which climate change should be addressed, with what level of urgency people see in relation to the climate agenda. Clearly, lots of organisations have declared an emergency, a climate emergency, but how do UNISON members sort of see the degree of urgency that we need to act? So on all of these measures, we see UNISON members are much, much more concerned about the issue of climate change. They see that much more likely to say that the effects are already now, and also much more likely to see that the climate emergency should be addressed with extreme urgency, that we really need to take action right now. One of the themes that we've been exploring is the extent to which kind of climate education and knowledge of climate issues sort of shapes and contributes to people's action and engagement in these topics. And we found that UNISON respondents were much more likely to say that they felt that they had a good knowledge of the causes of climate change compared to the UK worker average. So this may be an explainer in part of those results. So the next set of questions were kind of interesting ones in relation to this idea of climate emotions. And just to sort of explain a little bit about that, there's sort of debates about the extent to which, if we're trying to encourage, or if we want to sort of encourage our co-workers, our family, our communities to be more active in climate agendas, that how people feel about that agenda is an important factor. So are they hopeful that something can be done? Is there a sense of kind of guilt? Is there anxiety? We hear a lot about this notion of climate anxiety. Are people fearful of kind of climate change, or are they angry, outraged? I mean, clearly people can hold all of those emotions all at once, but the interesting difference between them perhaps gives us some indication of how we need to kind of communicate and engage with people, whether at work or outside. Outrage is felt to be an emotion that helps us mobilize people, in the sense that they feel that something really needs to be done. But alternatively, fear is something that can, if you like, demobilize people. Fear and anxiety can in fact cause people to think, you know, I'm not really sure that I can do anything sort of effectively about this. And clearly hope is also another motivating emotion. So understanding these different emotions is perhaps a conversation that's worth having with people that you might be trying to kind of involve in climate action and climate activities. What we see, interestingly, when we're comparing UNISON and UK workers, is this higher level across nearly all of these measures, more likely to be kind of outraged, but also more anxiety and perhaps fear. So sort of to summarize these kind of last couple of slides, UNISON members feel better informed, they're more concerned, but also more emotional about the kind of the prospects of climate change. And perhaps these are important things to take on board when we come to think about some of the more sort of specific actions that we're wanting to take in the workplace. So coming on to thinking about the workplace level, we asked a set of questions about whether participants were working in a context where their organisation was making plans to reduce carbon emissions. So we have this finding, so the orange numbers are there for UNISON, and the light blue ones, the turquoise ones, for the UK average. So we see that UNISON members tend to be in organisations that are making plans to address carbon reduction, and that might not be unexpected given, for example, local authorities declaring climate emergencies, or the kind of the duty on kind of government departments to decarbonise. So maybe that's not unexpected. But what is interesting is that we then ask, of those workers where they say that there are plans to decarbonise, has management consulted with you on these plans, and have you received relevant training on those, on any kind of mitigations that might be necessary? And what we can see is that there's a slightly lower level of consultation, but generally that's pretty poor, less than a quarter being kind of consulted on those plans, and much kind of lower levels of training and support to kind of be able to respond effectively in terms of delivering those plans. So perhaps another area to think about in terms of dialogue at work. On the right-hand side, we had an open question for the survey participants about what they felt needed to be prioritised in their workplace in order to decarbonise. And we've got three kind of key themes there. Green travel, climate education. So although respondents themselves feel generally informed about the causes of climate change, there's still a demand for kind of issues around climate education, maybe basic introductory for some, and maybe a kind of a more in-depth knowledge for others. And a third theme, which obviously lots of kind of green reps and workplace union greening projects have focused on, this sort of energy efficiency and energy savings as key themes. What was also interesting in the responses were the comments in relation to sort of management, resources, the need for leadership, and the need for better dialogue and engagement with staff around these issues, reflecting perhaps the questions on the left-hand side. So just to come on to the extent to which people themselves are active and taking action on climate change, again, one of the themes that we've been exploring is the fact that maybe people, are they active and taking action in their communities? Are they taking action at work? And how do these activities relate? So again, UNISON members are much more likely, as we see in the top left, to be doing some kind of climate action and carbon action to reduce our carbon footprint at home. If we come to the bottom left, we've also got about a fifth of participants who are involved in some kind of environmental campaign in their community. So that could be kind of political campaigning, anti-fracking, or it could be working locally, so for example around clean air campaigns around their schools. So there's quite a lot of activity there. And we also have UNISON members in the workplace. Around a quarter of participants are saying that they are involved in action at work in one way, shape or form. So that, again, that's quite interesting in terms of participation. And the sort of bottom right there, the 14% of people are also saying that they're involved in environmental campaigns through their union. Now, interestingly, that's much higher than the UK average, and I think that's testimony to UNISON's work in this area. So whilst there might seem there's loads more to do, I think that illustrates that this is something that is engaging members in some way, shape or form. There's plenty more to do, and in a sense what we take from the other data on that slide is how much we might draw the knowledge, the experience, the passion that means that people are active at home or in their communities. How can we bring that into action and activity at the workplace level? Okay, just make sure my slides. My keyboard's gone to sleep, so I'm going to use. I'm not going to dwell on this slide in terms of just for time's sake, but certainly want to ensure that we have sort of raise awareness of data that's in the report about broader support for kind of green economic policies. And I guess the sort of basic introductory point is that UNISON members are strongly supportive of, and the most favourable are around a kind of public funding, public support in terms of the energy transition, but also in terms of, if you like, the transport system transition. This sort of notion that, not only is having a decent integrated transport system, a good thing in terms of us getting to work, but that having it as a publicly owned integrated system is also part of a kind of climate plan to ensure that we take cars off the road and that we substitute car travel with different forms of kind of mobility. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit so that we've got time for kind of broader discussion, but we just wanted to come on to those themes that relate to how people see the prospect of the greening of the economy, in the sense, if we hope, well, we certainly hope that we do have a low carbon transition, we were interested to ask workers and UNISON members, how they view that. So generally, people are kind of positive that the transition might lead to jobs and jobs locally. There is also the recognition that there's a potential for job losses because some sectors or some occupations may be kind of affected directly by the need to decarbonise. And the kind of jury's out. On the right-hand side, this idea that those jobs may be better quality jobs, the decent jobs, is sort of not so sure. Less than half people think that kind of green jobs would be good jobs. So again, there's an interesting dimension there in terms of what are the challenges for unions in kind of campaigning to ensure that green jobs are kind of created are good jobs. We asked the same question to individuals in terms of how they felt this transition might affect them directly. So we have around a kind of small proportion of people in UNISON feel that they would need to change jobs, but there's a significant minority, over a quarter, who feel that they would need to learn new green skills. And again, I've got on the right hand side some people not so sure that if they did have to transition, that those jobs would be decent jobs. Sorry, I'll click through onto this next slide, which comes to the sort of broader policy idea of this notion of a just transition. So if we're thinking about the green transition or transitioning to a kind of a greener, low carbon world, there's recognition that potentially there should be some jobs lost, and that there would need to be reskilling, and that we would need to think of appropriate policies to support people in that transition. So we asked participants a range of questions about the kind of policy options and how much they supported these policy options on a scale of 1 to 10. And without doubt, the winner in the bottom right-hand side, particularly for UNISON members, is access to free training to reskill. And this is a really significant finding, much more so than the responses that we got from the workers across the UK more generally. But also this question, the sort of 9.1, the score of 9.1, if you like, out of 10, that the job quality of green jobs is also a really, really important dimension to thinking about what should be the ask in relation to a just transition. We asked, as well as thinking about the specific policies, the next slide shows about the kind of the basis upon which decisions and managing the just transition should be made. And as you can see, hardly anybody supports the idea that businesses should just be allowed to kind of get on with it, that there would need to be some intervention. So again, the need for strong union management agreements to plan and prepare for change. Also a strong response about involving communities affected by green economy plans in decision making. And on the bottom row there, clearly an important dimension is also drawing on the knowledge and insights of workers on how to decarbonise. As we see, there are quite often plans coming from the top, but very little consultation, and indeed, even more than just consultation on top-driven plans. The important finding of the potential for workers to know much more about how to decarbonise and how to act on climate change in their specific work areas. So that's it from me in terms of the data, and if Vera's with us, I'm going to pass over to her just to talk through the recommendations that are coming up from the survey.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jo. Apologies for the problems with the technology. I'm glad I can join you now. So hello from me as well, and thanks for the possibility to talk through some of the results that come out of the study that we have done for you. And I think the really interesting facts that comes through the data that we have presented here, we were then thinking, what does it actually mean? So we were kind of thinking what would be the kind of conclusions to draw from it. And as you have seen that the numbers of members who engage with climate change through their unions, through UNISON, is much higher than with other unions and much higher than with workers who are non-unionized, there is a really good basis to work on, but you've also seen the percentage is low compared to what people do at home, for example, or what they do at their workplaces. So there is probably a scope for action for the union itself to see, okay, we can engage more with members, and we need some materials that will help us with this communication with members. So the first recommendation would be to build up this kind of communication materials, but maybe also training materials, and that would then go in line with your motion at conference in 2020, that you would like to increase the growth of green reps. And this material would be a good basis for green reps then to communicate with the membership as well, and with other workers at the workplace. So that is probably an easy takeaway, that there is an appetite among members. They are really concerned, they are really committed to do something, and there is a scope to do more with members through the union itself. And then the next slide, please, Joe. So in this, the second element that has become clear is that there is a really good knowledge among workers themselves that is not taken into consideration yet. Workers have said it themselves. It would be much better to take into account how to respond to climate change at the workplace. So all the kind of ideas that workers have, the knowledge about the work process, about the labor process itself, needs to be taken on board, and that will help shaping a kind of pathways, both to know the needs in terms of what skills do we need for greening jobs or for new jobs, and what kind of priorities do we want to take in terms of decarbonizing our workplaces. So that's recommendation 4, that we think that there should be a much broader consultation process with workers about what are the key demands for decarbonizing, and what are the key demands for skills and training that are needed, and given the fact it should be free. And then we think that UNISON is really good placed to make a huge difference and to have a huge impact. So with the workplaces being in the public sector, so if all the procurement would follow green principles, that would already have a huge impact in terms of reducing emissions and shifting the kind of agenda setting in the public sector. Yeah, that's from us. We're really curious about your response, about your questions. This work is part of a bigger work. So as Joe has said, we have done a national survey. We are doing a big project where we compare just transition approaches. So we look at decarbonization pathways and the role that trade unions play for this in 12 countries. So the UK is one country, and we're really curious if you want to work with us further, if you have good ideas about what UNISON wants to do, please get in touch so we can talk to you. But there is going to be more work that will put this also in a broad international perspective to see what are other economies doing and what maybe we can learn from them as well. Thanks. So really looking forward to your input.
Thank you very much, Vera. Thank you very much, Joe, for that presentation and the outcome of the survey, but also the recommendations, which I think are all, well, certainly I would welcome all those recommendations, and hopefully members on the NEC and elsewhere can pick them up and run with them. And certainly, Vera, I'm pretty sure we will be back to discuss with you other work we can do. Okay, I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, Michelle Singleton. I'm not sure if your webcam is on yet, Michelle. I can't see you. Michelle is one of our policy officers at head office. We are very good as members at putting forward motions and demanding things get done, and NEC is no different from that as well. And then we say to Michelle, right, Michelle, get on with it. How are we going to progress this? One of the things we did agree at last year's national conference was that every branch should appoint an environment or a green officer, along with the various other branch officers. And obviously we'll be auditing that to see how many branches have followed through on that. But this is part of our real commitment to take the concerns of members that Joe and Vera, or Joe particularly was speaking about earlier on. It's pleasing to know that we are, our members are reasonably well informed, that we are emotional about it in that sense, and outraged to a high degree about it as well. And it's important, therefore, that we reflect that in the work that we do as a national union. Michelle, as I said, has got the task of pulling that together and helping us to take that forward. So, Michelle, over to you. Hello, Michelle. Michelle. Oh dear, I think we're having some more technical problems because we can't see or hear Michelle. Whilst we're waiting for Michelle to sort out, if you've noticed in the chat, if you've got questions that you want to put to the panel, please put them in the chat, or I think there's a question function. But we're looking for your questions, so please post them in there, and we'll try and respond to them as we go. Michelle, are you able to?
Can you hear me now? My speakers.
You're coming through now.
Oh, I am. Hooray! Okay, so I don't think you're going to get to see me, which is probably good news for everybody. But and I can't see anyone else either. But at least you can hear me now. Is that right?
Yes, we can hear you, Michelle.
Good, great. Okay, good. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, so not wanting to say anything any further. Yeah, some of you may know me, but many of you may not. So for those who don't, I'm Michelle Simpson, and as Stephen said, I'm a policy officer for UNISON. Fairly new to the climate change policy agenda, but very keen. It's not the only area that I have, because that's not how being a policy officer works, but it is, yeah, something that I've been heavily involved in since around September. And I haven't got a PowerPoint presentation, so if that wasn't going to work, we don't have to worry about that. I'm just going to run through what we're doing and what our focus is from a policy perspective, which all of this work and all of those things that we've just spoken about how engaged and how active our members want us to be, it has been incredibly good news, and it doesn't really surprise us either, though. But I'm glad to say that I don't work in isolation. There are other officers within UNISON who have climate change on their agenda as well. Our national officer responsible for our energy sector is Matt Lay, and obviously our energy sector has a great deal to say on this issue. Mary Onofaloju is our national officer for our transport sector, which was mentioned as part of the survey as well. And obviously climate has become a much bigger topic for them. And we also have Andrew Dobby working on the capital stewardship side of pensions, who is currently refreshing our guide on divesting from fossil fuels. And I saw a question in the chat about that. And almost every region and devolved nation now has an officer with some responsibility for this strand of organising, and we are attempting to try and expand the networking opportunities of that. So this survey report was really important for us because climate change isn't an obvious bread and butter part of what trade unions usually do. And despite us being very clear about why this is a core trade union issue, it can sometimes be hard to justify why we're dedicating any resources to it in the middle of all the other terms and conditions and urgent pay issues. But this survey clearly shows what we absolutely felt to be true, which is that our members expect and want us to be active on climate change. And while some of us felt this was fairly self-evident, this survey supports our efforts to prioritise and resource this vital area of work. And it's interesting that despite knowing that members and activists are engaged and care about this issue, it's only fairly recently that our policy-making structures have been able to demonstrate that, because although UNISON has had some level of policy engagement in this area for several years, last year was the first time any motion on climate change, let alone the NEC-led motion, which was there, was actually prioritised by our lay structures to reach the floor of the National Delegate Conference and get voted on. And I'm pleased to say that there's another quite lengthy motion that everyone can get behind on this year's agenda as well. And that shows the importance this area now has within UNISON, and rightly so. So public services are a key part of UK decarbonisation plans. It's an area that central government has direct responsibility and agency power to do something about, unlike in other areas. And this won't be news because I say it every time, and it's in all of our publications on this. public services directly emit around 8% of the UK's greenhouse gases, and that's without including public transport. And then when you add the influence on procurement, construction and social housing, the impact is even bigger. And UNISON has members across all public services, and all are affected by either directly or indirectly by climate change, whether it's in the health service, managing the increased health impacts of excess heat or pollution, or in the environmental agency or equivalent in developed nations, where our members' role is to respond to the floods and droughts and other direct environmental impacts. So it's not just from a citizenship point of view. This is very much an issue that is impacting on our members in their work on the front line. So it's no surprise that our members are getting more and more engaged on this issue and expecting us to be as well. And we're clear that we've got 3 strands to our role. We need to engage, obviously, politically with the current and prospective governments on ensuring the necessary changes and the funding needed to meet their commitments. And this is easier with some of our governments than others. We need to work in coalition, and we do, with like-minded organisations, the TUC and other unions, to further the aims and objectives that are common to us all on this agenda. So I've just got a notice coming up about joining the meeting. I hope you can still hear me. I'm just gonna carry on anyway. But also,
carry on, we can hear you.
Good. On a much more fundamental level, and absolutely tuned into the survey results, our role is absolutely to encourage and enable our members to get active and involved in the local transformations and negotiations that need to happen. And that's not just, in our view, a trade union and employer situation. That has to be a social partnership model where underrepresented groups in local communities are also at the table. But we do all need to be at the table, and trade unions obviously are a key part of who needs to be at the table. So we did a lot of you will know that we did a report of a fully costed set of measures for getting to net zero in public services by 2050. And you can find that report and key recommendations. I won't spend any time talking about it now because we're limited time, but hopefully we can get a link in the chat for that if you haven't seen it already. But what it shows is that right now, public service workplaces are an excellent place to start tackling climate change in the UK. And in many areas, the door is already open for having those discussions. Not everywhere, not in enough places, but in a lot of places, because there is this imperative on the employers to meet those targets. They'll need all the skills that they can get and willing participants that they can get their hands on, and more employers are beginning to recognise that. So as many of you will know, last year, and Stephen mentioned it as well, we have this new role, and where people did have environmental officers or green reps voluntarily on their branches, it is now mandatory. And Stephen mentioned that we'll be hoping to sort of audit that and see where we are with it. And we did manage to get a question into the annual organising framework questionnaire, which is about the only piece of mandatory information gathering that we can do in UNISON. We managed to get a question in about whether branches had spotted that rule change, whether they'd appointed to the position, and the results of that will be with us in end of March time. So we should be able to use that to see where the activity is and respond appropriately with offers of support where the activity is, but also importantly where it hasn't really taken off, and try and focus our attentions elsewhere there. And Stephen's spoken a little bit about the fact that this isn't just a local issue. We have to get this right. Just transition has to be a global policy as well as a local one, because otherwise it just doesn't work. We can't solve all of our problems in the UK by human rights abuses in other countries, and it simply wouldn't work if we tried anyway. So climate change policy in public services is inextricably linked to policies on public health, the cost of living crisis, education and skills, and almost all other areas of public policy. And UNISON is working to ensure that climate policy is incorporated into our other policy areas too. We know that we need to try and give some more basic support. We've issued a few guides recently, but I'm currently going to be meeting with regional contacts to discuss how we might go about a wider piece of work on providing a just transition guide, because there's a whole load of jargon that would be involved, and just demystifying what it isn't, and importantly, and this is really hard work, trying to get to those best practice areas where work is already going on, whether it be in our employers or in others, that can give good, tangible, clear examples of some things that people can aim for. But solutions will be local. There is no one size fits all in terms of answers for any of this. I mean, one area is working from home could actually have a climate impact that makes things worse because more people are heating their own homes than one building. But actually, in other areas, it would be absolutely the right thing to do in terms of the impact on transport and other areas. So we're aiming to provide more levels of support. There's training, which I think I've seen links to in the chat already, that can be rolled out. And that's not just general basic understanding training. We're sort of developing in our learning and organising services by UNISON College are developing additional training modules. There's currently one being rolled out for local government specifically, and there's another one that's very close to being rolled out for health as well. So we do know that there's a clear need for that support and resources to help people get engaged, because this is an opportunity for UNISON and the trade unions generally, but particularly UNISON in the public sector, to be at that table, not be talking about the contentious issues of pay, which we have to talk about as well, but actually work in partnership, working to try and solve, this incredibly difficult issue. So last couple of things, because I do want to be enough time for questions, despite our late start, is that we're currently involved in via Labour Link in engaging on our response to the Labour Party National Policy Forum consultation, which should help to shape Labour Party policy in this area. And as you will have spotted, it is one of their key strands, which, although we might not agree with everything in their plans, currently it's good news in terms of being a priority issue if they are successful in being the next Westminster government. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that while it hasn't been agreed yet, and this would happen via the National Delegate Conference motion process, we are exploring, as part of the organising framework, declaring a UNISON Year of the Green Rep, which, with all the appropriate organising and operational support that comes with that, can really highlight and amplify UNISON's response to the climate emergency. So I'm hoping very much that motion with that suggestion gets passed at this year's conference. But I'll leave it there because I'm aware that we're shorter on time than we were hoping to be.
Thank you, Michelle, for a quick run through of everything that we're trying to do. I'm conscious of time. We did start a little bit late. We're scheduled to finish at past. Hopefully we can go on to about 25 to 22 if that's okay with the panel and everybody else. If that's not okay, somebody can cut me off at past. There are a number of questions that have come up in the chat, far too many that we won't be able to deal with them all in the time available, even if I do extend the meeting. Just very quickly, just maybe to pick up a couple of points from it. UNISON has been involved with Divest UK just in the past this week, and last night Andrew Dobie, that Michelle mentioned, was speaking at one of their online events, speaking about how pensions divestment can be positive in terms of investing in other more better areas, and I know a number of branches are involved in some of the process and activities tomorrow and on Saturday around the whole question of divestment. So that's one thing. We are maybe consistent with some of the recommendations. We are rolling out some green skills training. I think the details of that, the link to that is in the chat. So if you are interested, if you're one of those new green reps or green officers or environment officers or whatever we've decided to call them, then you maybe want to try and link into that training and encourage others in your branch to do that as well. In terms of the breadth of the motions, the breadth of the policy, the motion which is going to conference in the name of the National Executive Committee is one of the longest motions we've ever submitted. So we're trying to cover all sorts of things there, from our own organisation to the general policies of divestment or stopping the exploration for oil and gas in the North Sea and so on and so forth. So if you think free transport, which was one of the questions which is in the chat, is one of the policies that we should be supporting, then get that motion into conference and raise that from the conference floor. That would be one way of shaping the conference. It's certainly something which personally I think is something we should be aiming at, getting people out of their cars and onto public transport, which has to be affordable and efficient. It would be one way forward. We are involved in a number of organisations. I represent UNISON on the coordinating group of the Climate Justice Coalition, which came out of the COP26 coalition, which organised the big demonstrations around COP26. And the Climate Justice Coalition is having a trade union workers conference later in the year, May, I think it is. I should know the date off the top of my head, but I have to confess it's slipped me just now. But look out for that. So there's a whole range of things that we are involved in. We're trying to work with allies and to take those things forward. But critically, all this does depend upon members and branches doing that. A number of the regions have regional networks. I know in Scotland we've had a green network for a number of years. I know some are exist in the northwest. I think Northern region and Wales have also that. There may be others, but that'd be one of the things that everybody should do is to check out what's happening in your region about that. And in terms of the part of Michelle's role, in terms of coordinating a national green network, of making sure all those environment green reps are linked up. So if you don't get the newsletters from Michelle, then look to see how you can get linked onto that, and maybe we could put in the chat if somebody can do that, how we could do that. So that's me just trying to summarise some of the issues that came from the chat. In terms of the specific questions to the panel, there's lots of them, but if perhaps one of the first questions is whether those with green jobs have less climate anxiety. I'm not sure, Joe or Vera, whether that kind of detail was able to be gleaned from the survey. But the other question is whether the scale of the survey was representative enough to allow us to use that as a way forward. So what are your thoughts on that, Joe or Vera?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this. So it's not representative for UNISON because it was a kind of link that we've sent out, that UNISON sent out, and it was then voluntarily who signed up. So there is certainly some kind of bias. Those who were very concerned are more likely to take part in the survey. The data that we've compared UNISON data through, that has been representative for the UK, and there we have a huge number of union members as well answering, and then that is representative. So we would be able to compare the kind of data and provide you with some data what the kind of representative part of UNISON is thinking, and then that would be also interesting to look at how the kind of self-selected group here is doing. But because those surveys are always voluntary, there is no way really to prevent this kind of bias. The regional effects that you were asking to, are there regional effects? So we are currently working on a lot of academic papers where we are particularly interested in this. What role does place play? So what role does unemployment rate play? What role do the general skills levels play on the outlook of this? But that data is not yet available. So, but if you follow us on the website, then there will be quite regularly now coming updates. We also have a podcast series where you then can digest some of the upcoming results more easily.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Phil. Joe.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Basic skills, still struggling with. In terms of, there were a couple of really interesting points as to whether UNISON members who are working in the NHS, in local government, see their jobs as kind of potentially green jobs. And I think this is a really interesting point of discussion, in that clearly there's debate about what do we mean by a green job, and sometimes that's quite narrowly defined in terms of it's the renewables or parts of the economy that might be kind of reforestation or kind of environmental projects that are around kind of conservation or kind of regreening of our land use. But it's interesting that increasingly there's kind of recognition that the contribution to decarbonising is across sectors, it's across occupations. So in addition to those kind of what we might be a sort of a 100% green job, there will be a much larger range of occupations that will need to think about or in a sense, reimagine themselves as being part of this kind of low carbon future. So there's this sort of debate about what is a green job. So it's not a super exciting debate, but I think it's a really important contribution that by supporting various aspects of our kind of local economy, whether that's about supporting the retrofit in housing, that is going to need green skills and training. So, you know, the sort of people in FE, if they're contributing to that process of kind of the greening of work, then, you know, that is part of this wider, if you like, system of change that we'll all need to be involved in terms of the greening of our economy. But I think that building that kind of communication, as Vera was saying in the recommendations, that not just some of the challenges of climate change, but how our work as, you know, in all kinds of different spheres is going to contribute to that change, is a really important part of the dialogue, so people don't feel disconnected from the transition. And in terms of are green economy workers less anxious? That's a really interesting question, and we'll look at that analysis and get back to you. We asked a slightly different question in the national survey. As Vera was saying, it's kind of that is representative because of the way that the panel was selected to ensure that it did have representation across nations and regions. We asked people if they were interested in a kind of a set of jobs and occupations, or were working in a set of jobs and occupations that would be defined as green jobs, and what their motivations would be if they were kind of switching into what might be defined as a green job. And whilst we're interested, because we do research on employment relations, we're really interested in job quality and these issues of kind of decent work, it was also really notable and really profound, sort of that sense of that people want to work in an area where they feel that they are contributing to, either contributing against climate change or certainly not contributing to it. Because there was another comment in the chat about kind of workers. You might be representing members who may be in the more kind of polluting industries, and how do they feel about this agenda? There's quite a lot to say about that, probably than we've got time for in this webinar, but a couple of really interesting, just quick things to point about, and we can talk more, or, you know, I can point to resources if people are interested in. But particularly in Scotland, there's been a really interesting dialogue developing about oil and gas workers and their kind of transition, what they would need if there is to be a transition away from fossil fuel extraction. And that's an active debate that's going on right now, and a really, really important one. And then clearly there are workers in other sectors like steel. We've been working with Community Union, who are in industries that are really demanding the kind of investment that's needed for we know what technology is needed to decarbonise them, but they need big investment. So there needs to be that kind of sustained conversation about, in order to really meet the decarbonisation pathways of those sectors, that investment is really needed. You know, workers are willing and ready to make the change, but they can't if the investment isn't there in those new technologies.
Thanks, Jo. Just coming back on a couple of points there. In Scotland, it was UNISON who helped set up the Just Transition Partnership between the STDC, Friends of Earth Scotland, and other trade unions and other environment groups, which then led to the setting up by the Scottish Government of the Scottish Just Transition Commission. So it's important that debate that started a number of years ago in Scotland, which we were involved in, goes on. And one of the things we have had to discuss is, what do we mean by green jobs? And UNISON has been very clear in saying that essentially a green job is a job which doesn't cause pollution, which doesn't create the greenhouse gases that are causing global warming. So many of the jobs, I would argue, many of the jobs that our members do, whether it's in education and health, social care, they're green jobs, and they're the kind of jobs that we should be investing in the future, as well as in the renewable sectors. So we shouldn't be shy about saying, actually, our members are already involved in a green economy because we are part of those kind of services and investment. And the Just Transition Commission, when it reported earlier, or last year now, they talked about the need for investment in the social infrastructure, because if we're going to create jobs, in the economy. It's the economy we need to transition, not just the energy sector, it's the whole economy. And we need to invest in those kind of social jobs, the kind of jobs that many of our members are involved in. But it is a really important point. There's been a couple of points in the chat, just in terms of our own organisation. So in terms of the newsletter that I referred to, that Michelle produces, the link to that is in the chat. So please, if you haven't seen that before, have a look at that, and that gives you that and the details of the Climate Justice Coalition Trade Union Conference, which I couldn't remember when it was. That's also in the chat, the 20th of May. So encourage people to look out for that and get along to that. A number of the other questions relate to a couple of policies. There's a question about Safe Britain's rivers. I don't know if we are actively involved in that, but there's no reason why branches shouldn't be. It seems to me it's the sort of thing that members are probably quite keen and interested in. So don't be shy about putting forward in your own branch that we should be supporting that kind of campaign. And if you think the NEC should be doing more about it, then a letter to the NEC or a motion to the NEC or an emergency motion to National Conference or whatever way you seek to raise that, I would encourage the Green reps to think about, and helping to influence what the union does at a national level. One of the things we did agree, and Michelle made some reference to, is that in each of our service groups we should be thinking through what our bargaining agenda is in terms of what are we negotiating, because that's what you do, we negotiate in the campaign. So what are we negotiating with our employers? And one of the questions was about facility time, and that clearly has to be one of the issues that we're trying to negotiate. So at a local level, branch level, yes, we should do it, but the questioner is quite right, it's not something that should just be left to branches. We need to be raising this at a national level. But if there are any successes at a local level where facility time has been afforded to allow people to do some of this work, then please let us know, because a really good example can be used to highlight that issue. Michelle, did you want to pick up on some of the questions that are in the chat there about what the union is doing?
The ones that I was keen to pick up on, you sort of alluded to there being a link in the chat for the newsletter. The website has a lot of resources, but they're not necessarily easy to find. But on the front page of the UNISON website, and a link to this section has been put in the chat, but they're under campaigns. The green campaign is there, and within that you can sign up to the network newsletter, but also there's a toggle at the bottom for resources, which has a number of things, including basic and more in-depth guides to what being a green rep is, and then all the different levels of it, because someone asked a question about that. And also there were some interesting things in the chat that I think are worth us trying to think about and weave in, like someone mentioned about green volunteer days and things like that. So, all those kind of things are things that I think we can do wider work to try and, because people, we need new views, new ideas on how any of this will be working. And we do need to share best practice where it's happening. It's one of the things UNISON finds very hard to do, is to get those examples of what's happening locally in, so that we can recycle them, share them, and encourage other people with what's going on and best practice. So something we're going to keep on plugging away at. Facility time, it's one of the specific asks in our response to the Labour Party consultation, but it's also a key part of, I think, one of the actions in our motion to conference, to make it our policy that we pursue that. So do go back to your branches and make sure they all prioritise the green motion. I'm sure they will. But that's a clear part of it that we need to get. And of course, it's only in public sector that any government can effect that, although they can treat it in the same way. And this is what we would hope, as a health and safety officer, and have mandatory availability as well. But locally is important, so we can show that it works. And in some areas it will be already being given or assumed. So getting those examples in so that we can share them and use them in all the different areas that we do on every angle of what we're doing is always going to be important for us.
Thanks, Michelle. There was one question which I don't think we've touched upon, which was about working from home, which obviously lots of people have started to do and continue to do, or maybe on a hybrid basis. But obviously one of the concerns about that is that essentially the employer's offsetting its own energy costs by, we're having to heat our own homes. And I know that where I am in Scotland, that's a major issue, as I sit with 3 cardigans on when I'm working from home. So I don't know whether Joe or Vera have got any information about negotiations that might have been taking place in any sector about whether workers are getting support for that, the additional costs, and indeed whether it makes sense to have people working from home in badly insulated homes with inefficient energy systems rather than working in a proper workplace, and whether there's a way in which employers could assist with, I don't know, the insulation of your home to allow you to be efficient. I don't know if you have anything you could tell us about that,
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this question, because we have actually done at the University of Leeds, we have done a calculation coming from, okay, so if we all work from home, what are the effect in terms of reducing the emissions? Because it's kind of advertised, or the kind of assumption is that will help us reducing emissions, but basically it's not that straightforward. So if you model different scenarios when, let's say, colleagues work from home 2 days a week and they come into the office 3 days a week, it only really saves emissions if the buildings would be closed off during the time that colleagues stay at home. But I mean, for us as a university, they are running all the time. And even if you didn't have students coming in and out, it would still mean that then you use the offices only half the time of the week and don't have running costs there. So it's not really straightforward in terms of decarbonizing the economy to say that working from home is better. And exactly as the colleague has pointed out, there is the question of, is it not just shifting the costs and also then the emissions basically to the individuals and to the workers. In our institution, we are talking about this, and there were kind of suggestions that we get an extra pay for the increased energy costs due to working from home, but it's far from being anywhere put on paper or agreed. But I completely encourage you that this has to be part of the negotiations. Who is bearing the costs?
So just to add, Stephen, an example from UCU. I was actually at a strike at the so-called UCU have teach-outs during their strike days to sort of basically to say that it's not that we don't love teaching, it's and the topics are often things that we would be interested to teach and share across staff and students. And the UCU Liverpool University and the Liverpool Hope University have both worked up what they're calling a Green New Deal bargaining claim. So this is a kind of a framework that UCU have been working with a kind of student campaign, a student climate campaign that grew out of the National Union of Students. So there's a mixture of kind of what students are wanting to see in terms of climate education, but also bargaining around issues to do with jobs, sustainable jobs, and our research. And as Vera was saying, how as an organisation, how as institutions do we decarbonise as well. And so I'm happy to share a link to the, I mean, they're in the first phases of that negotiation, because clearly one of the difficulties was the employers saying, well, they didn't recognise that this was a topic that they should engage with the union on, and they've managed to persuade them, okay, it's not part of the formal negotiation, but it is something that they're entering into dialogue on. So that's an interesting first step, and making sure they're getting the right people in the room when it, around those negotiations. And the topic around kind of working from home was they admitted was not something that they had thought about when they were drafting it, because they were drafting it a couple of years ago before it was an issue. So I'm sure it's something that's going to come up on the agenda kind of more concretely, as we've got whole swathes of people in our sector that are now almost permanently working from home.
Okay, thanks. Colleagues,
I was wondering whether I could come in on one of the questions, Stephen. So there's someone who's mentioned a question about transition and skills and retraining, and that's something that we've absolutely recognised. And obviously, most of you will know that UNISON has a very strong, we have UNISON College, a very strong learning and skills investment and department. But the link between, if we're going to have a just transition, then people are going to need to reskill and be encouraged to reskill. And the link between that and our current universal credit system, which does not support people retraining, it has a huge impact on insecure work, on low pay, but it obviously will have a massive impact if they don't do something about supporting people in education reskilling. Then just transition isn't going to happen. So that's a plank of the work that we do sort of centrally, but it can be done locally as well. So just as an example, in Swansea, I think it was in a local council, they've retrained people, mechanics who used to work on their non-electric cars to be skilled and retrained. The council have paid for them to retrain to deal with electric cars. I mean, that's kind of an immediate quid pro quo that was perhaps easy to facilitate. But there is a wider issue, and there are other ways that people need to be enabled to not have to lose their income, to step out of work and then spend time retraining with no support behind them, because that's just not going to happen. So yeah, that's a good question. It's something we are feeding into what we do.
Okay, thanks very much. Colleagues, I'm very conscious of the time, and I've used the chair and extended the time, but I think I've got to recognise that I can only go so far with that, and that is, I think some people are here on their lunchtime, they'll probably have to get back to work. So I'm going to wind up the meeting with just a few closing remarks. There was a last question there about the need for regional networks or regional reps. And that's absolutely a commitment to the union, given that we've said to all the regions that we would want to see them establish that kind of regional network of the green reps. As I said earlier on, a number of them are already up and running. And if there isn't one in your region, speak to the regional convener or the regional secretary and say that Stephen Smiley said you have to set one up. And then I'll say it was Michelle's idea, and that way I'll protect myself. But no, in all seriousness, yes, that's absolutely essential. We need to have that kind of network for people supporting each other and sharing information. There was a question about whether we should have monthly meetings for the UK. I have to say, I think that's probably a little bit too much. But certainly, one of the commitments that Michelle and myself can give is we will have more of these webinars. We had a few last year, and we will intend to have some more later on in the year, because it is important that we get the chance to share ideas and learn from each other, as well as learning from people like Joe and Vera who can contribute to this. So certainly we need to do more of this, and we can do them online. So it's not as if I have to go to travel miles and miles, creating more emissions. So we can do that, and we can do that effectively. So that's certainly something that we're working on. And if you've got ideas, the kind of subjects you would want us to discuss, then please fire them in via either your regional networks or directly to Michelle. I should have said at the outset that Joe and Vera caused us a little bit of anxiety in the past few days because we weren't sure about certain things because they were on strike. So I should have said solidarity to our colleagues in the UCU for their continuing industrial action, and wish you good luck for that in the future. So I should have said that at the beginning, but thankfully you're back at work today, so I allow you to be here today. So I want to thank Joe and Vera for the work they did in relation to the survey and assembling the information that they were able to then come along and share as the recommendations which Joe and Vera have given to us. I think that would encourage everyone to take a note of them and discuss them and feed in the ideas, and certainly that will inform the work that Michelle and I do on the NEC and the policy committee of the NEC, and we will take into national conference. So finally, just thank everyone for coming along today, and apologies for the technical hiccups along the way, but I think we finally got there, and maybe we'll do a webinar on how to do a webinar at some stage, so we're not more confident about it. But thank you very much, especially to Joe and Vera for coming along, and for Michelle for her contribution. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you again on another webinar. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Stephen, Michelle, John in the background.
Thanks. Bye.